Dawn broke over a mud-choked valley in Italy, 1944. Rain turned the ground into a cauldron of steam and sulfur as American mortar crews scrambled to set up under German fire. Their shells were hitting wide, harmless thuds against distant hills, swallowed by the fog and the roar of distant artillery. The M2 60mm mortar was a beautiful weapon in theory, portable, reliable. But in the rocky chaos of the Italian campaign, it had one fatal flaw. It wasn't hitting hard enough, and it wasn't reaching far enough. German machine gun nests sat just beyond effective range, mocking the Allied advance with bursts of tracer fire that sliced through the morning mist. Then, a young corporal from Kansas, the son of a wheat farmer who'd spent his childhood packing homemade shotgun shells, made a decision no manual ever taught. He reached into his field kit, tore open the standard powder charge, and quietly mixed in a different ratio. A trick he'd learned watching his father adjust black powder loads back on the farm. Moments later, his mortar rounds started landing with terrifying precision and force no one could explain. If you love stories hidden behind history's headlines, hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next. To understand what happened that morning, you need to understand the weapon itself. The M2 60mm mortar was introduced in 1940, weighing just 42 pounds with its base plate and bipod. It could be carried by a two-man crew and fired up to 18 rounds per minute in skilled hands. Its maximum range was listed at 1,815 yards, about a mile. But on paper and in the field are two different worlds. In the mountains of Italy, where rain turned soil into soup and elevation played tricks on trajectory, that range often shrank. Add in the weight of mud on boots, the exhaustion of men who hadn't slept in days, and the constant threat of counter-battery fire, and the M2 became more of a psychological tool than a game-changer. It announced presence, it harassed, but it rarely delivered knockout blows. The Germans knew this. Their MG-42 machine guns, firing 1,200 rounds per minute, were positioned just outside mortar range on purpose. They'd studied American tactics. They knew the GIs would try to suppress them with mortars before advancing. So they dug in at the edge of effective fire, close enough to kill, far enough to survive. It was a calculated cruelty, and for months it worked. The young corporal's name has been lost to time, or perhaps never recorded at all. What survives are fragments, letters home, unit after-action reports, and whispered stories passed between veterans long after the war ended. Some say he was from Kansas. Others claim Oklahoma or Nebraska. What's consistent is this: he grew up on a farm, and his father reloaded ammunition. In rural America during the Depression, buying factory shells was a luxury. Farmers learned to make their own. They'd buy lead shot, primers, and gunpowder in bulk, then hand-pack shotgun shells at the kitchen table. The art wasn't just in the assembly, it was in the adjustment. Too much powder and the shell could rupture the barrel. Too little and the shot wouldn't carry. The perfect load was a matter of feel, trial, and generational knowledge passed down like a family recipe. The corporal had watched his father do this 1,000 times. He'd learned to read burn rates by the color of smoke. He knew that faster-burning powders generated higher initial pressure but dropped off quicker. Slower powders built momentum gradually. Less flash, more sustained push. That knowledge was about to become a weapon. By early 1944, the Allied advance through Italy had become a nightmare. The campaign that was supposed to be a swift march to Rome had turned into a grinding war of attrition. The Germans held the high ground, literally. Mountains, rivers, and fortified positions turned every mile into a bloodbath. At Monte Cassino, American and British forces faced one of the most formidable defensive lines in military history. The Gustav Line stretched across Italy, anchored by ancient monasteries, stone farmhouses, and interlocking fields of fire. The Germans had months to prepare. They knew every rock, every sight line, every killing zone. The Allies had artillery, yes, but artillery needed supply lines, clear roads, and forward observers. In the mud and chaos, those luxuries were rare. What infantry needed was portable firepower they could carry themselves, something that could reach enemy positions when the big guns couldn't. That's where the mortar came in, or was supposed to. The M2's standard propellant charge was a carefully measured increment system. Soldiers could add or remove powder increments, small cloth bags sewn into the tail fins of each round to adjust range. It was safe, it was predictable, and in Italy's vertical terrain, it was proving inadequate. Something had to change. The innovation didn't happen in a laboratory or a rear echelon testing range. It happened in the dirt, under fire, in a moment of desperate improvisation. The corporal's unit was pinned down near a river crossing south of Cassino. German positions on the far ridge were shredding every attempt to advance. Machine gun fire came in disciplined bursts, 3 to 5 rounds, then silence, then another burst. Professional, deadly, just beyond mortar range. He'd already tried the maximum charge configuration, 6 increments. The rounds landed close, but not close enough. The German gunners didn't even bother relocating. They knew the math. That's when the corporal made his choice. He opened his pack and pulled out something he'd been carrying since North Africa, a small cloth pouch of loose propellant powder salvaged from damaged rounds. It was against regulations to keep it, dangerous even, but he'd kept it anyway, some instinct telling him it might matter. He tore open a standard rounds increment bag. Then, with the precision his father had taught him, he added a measured pinch of the faster-burning powder to the existing charge. Not much, just enough to spike the initial pressure and flatten the trajectory. He loaded the round, dropped it down the tube, and everything changed. The explosion on the ridge was different, not just louder, sharper. The concussive thump carried a weight that made men flinch even from hundreds of yards away. Where standard rounds had kicked up dirt and dust, this one tore into the German position with the authority of a 105mm howitzer shell. Silence followed, then frantic shouting in German. The corporal's squad leader stared at him. "What the hell did you just do?" He didn't answer. He was already preparing the next round. Same modification, same careful addition of propellant. He adjusted elevation by a hair and fired again. Another direct hit. This time secondary explosions, ammunition cooking off inside the German position. Black smoke spiraled into the gray Italian sky. Within minutes, word spread through the platoon, then the company. By nightfall, mortar crews across the regiment were quietly asking the Kansas farm boy for his secret. He showed them, not with manuals or official approval, but with the same patient instruction his father had used teaching him to reload shells in the barn. The technique was dangerous. One miscalculation and the mortar tube could rupture, killing the crew. But in a war where death was already waiting in every direction, soldiers made their own calculations. They chose the risk. The modification spread like wildfire through American mortar units in Italy. It had no official name. Some called it hot loading. Others referred to it as the Kansas mix, or simply the trick. What mattered was that it worked. Suddenly, M2 mortars were reaching targets they had no business reaching. German positions that had been untouchable were getting hammered by rounds that shouldn't have been able to get there. The psychological effect was immediate. The Germans had based their entire defensive strategy on range calculations. They knew where American mortars could and couldn't hit. Now those calculations were worthless. But the innovation came with costs. Not every crew understood the chemistry involved. Some added too much powder too quickly. Tubes burst. Men died. After-action reports from March 1944 show a spike in mortar accidents among U.S. units. Equipment failure, the report said. But veterans knew better. The Army's Ordnance Corps began investigating. Engineers examined ruptured tubes, analyzed propellant residue, and interviewed survivors. What they found disturbed them: evidence of field modifications that violated every safety protocol, variations in powder composition, inconsistent burn rates, charges that should have never been loaded into a standard mortar tube. And yet, in the mountains of Italy, they were winning firefights that conventional tactics said they should lose. By April 1944, the practice had become so widespread that it could no longer be ignored. A colonel from the Ordnance Department arrived at the front lines demanding answers. He gathered a group of mortar crews and asked them directly, what were they doing to their weapons? The room went silent. The Kansas corporal, now a sergeant, finally spoke. He explained the modification in plain terms: the burn rate adjustment, the pressure spike, the extended range, and increased payload effectiveness. He showed them his salvaged powder pouch and demonstrated the measuring technique his father had taught him. The colonel's face went through several colors. What these men were describing was, technically, the creation of an improvised explosive device using military ordnance. It was court-martial territory. It was also, and he had to admit this, devastatingly effective. Field tests were ordered. Under controlled conditions, modified rounds were fired alongside standard loads. The results were undeniable. The modifications increased effective range by 15 to 20% and dramatically improved terminal effects on hardened targets. The rounds hit harder because the faster initial burn created more violent fragmentation of the shell casing. But the variability was too high. Different powder lots burned at different rates. One man's perfect load could be another man's fatal mistake. The Army faced an impossible choice. The official position was clear. The modifications were forbidden, too dangerous, too inconsistent. Mortar crews were ordered to use only factory standard propellant charges. Violators would face disciplinary action. In the rear areas, that order might have stuck, but on the front lines, facing German machine guns and mortars that hit back with precision, soldiers made different decisions. They continued to modify charges, but they got smarter about it. They shared knowledge more carefully. The best practitioners, the ones who understood the chemistry, who measured precisely, who treated the process with the respect it demanded, began teaching others. It became an underground craft, passed from veteran to replacement like a secret handshake. The Germans noticed the change in American mortar effectiveness, but couldn't identify the cause. Their intelligence reports from captured documents showed no new weapon systems. The tubes were the same M2 mortars they'd been facing for months. Yet suddenly, those mortars were suppressing positions that should have been safe. Some German commanders theorized the Americans had received new ammunition types. Others suspected improved training. The truth that individual soldiers were field-modifying propellant charges using Depression-era farmhouse knowledge was so irregular, so unmilitary, that it never appeared as a serious hypothesis in Wehrmacht analysis documents. The Allies had stumbled onto asymmetric warfare by accident. The breakthrough at Anzio in May 1944 offered the clearest evidence of the modification's impact. American forces had been pinned on the beachhead for months, unable to break out against entrenched German positions. Every inch of ground came at horrific cost. But in the final push, mortar crews using modified charges provided covering fire that allowed infantry to close gaps they'd previously been unable to cross. The Germans reported being hit by what they assumed was close-range artillery, but it was mortars, firing at distances and with effects that exceeded their theoretical capabilities. After-action assessments credited improved coordination and tactical refinement, but the men who were there knew different. They knew that the farm boy's trick had given them an edge measured not in miles but in yards. And in war, yards are often the difference between breakthrough and massacre. By June, as Allied forces prepared for the liberation of Rome, the modified mortar technique had become standard practice in veteran units. New replacements were quietly taught the method by squad leaders. No written manual, no official training. Just practical instruction delivered in foxholes and bomb craters, one careful demonstration at a time. The U.S. Army had accidentally created a grassroots weapons development program. The true revelation came in July 1944 when Army engineers finally conducted comprehensive testing of the field modifications under laboratory conditions. What they discovered shocked the ordnance establishment. The soldiers weren't just randomly adding powder. They'd independently rediscovered principles of internal ballistics that weapons designers had spent decades refining. By adjusting the burn rate profile of the propellant charge, they were optimizing pressure curves in ways that standard increment systems couldn't achieve. The Kansas mix, when properly executed, created a dual-stage burn. The faster powder spiked initial pressure, driving the round out of the tube with greater velocity. The remaining slower-burning powder sustained acceleration down the barrel, maximizing muzzle energy without exceeding safe pressure limits. It was, in effect, a crude version of what would later become standard in modern artillery, progressive propellant technology. But here's what made it extraordinary. These soldiers had figured it out through trial, error, and intuition. No computer models, no pressure gauges, just experience, observation, and the kind of practical knowledge that comes from growing up in places where you fix things yourself or they stayed broken. The engineers' report concluded that while the field modifications were too inconsistent for official adoption, the underlying principles were sound. Recommendations were made for future propellant development. Those recommendations would shape artillery design for the next 3 decades. The Kansas corporal, by now a staff sergeant, was quietly pulled from the line in August 1944. He was told he was being reassigned to a training role. What actually happened was more complex. Army intelligence had gotten involved. They wanted to understand not just what he'd done, but how he'd learned to do it. They interviewed him for hours. They brought in chemists and ballistics experts. They made him demonstrate his measuring technique again and again. What emerged from those interviews was a picture of informal knowledge networks that existed completely outside official military channels. The sergeant described how his father had learned reloading from his father, who'd learned it from hunters and trappers in the 1880s. He talked about community knowledge, how farmers across the Midwest shared information about powder loads, primer types, and ballistic performance, the way other communities shared recipes. The military had always assumed that weapons expertise flowed from the top down, from engineers to soldiers. What they were discovering was that knowledge also flowed horizontally, and sometimes from the bottom up. That soldiers brought skills from civilian life that no training manual could teach. The sergeant was awarded a Bronze Star. The citation mentioned initiative and technical proficiency in weapons employment. It never mentioned what he'd actually done. The truth was classified. The revelation's full scope only became clear decades later when military historians gained access to previously classified ordnance reports. What they found was extraordinary. The field modifications in Italy hadn't been isolated incidents. Similar innovations had appeared independently in units across Europe and the Pacific. A mortar crew in Normandy had experimented with propellant adjustments. Another in the Philippines had done the same. Each time, the innovation emerged from soldiers with specific civilian backgrounds: gunsmiths, hunters, chemists, even fireworks manufacturers. The pattern suggested something profound: that military effectiveness isn't just about equipment and training, but about the accumulated knowledge a society brings to war. The Allies had an advantage the Wehrmacht couldn't replicate. American and British Commonwealth forces drew from civilian populations with deep traditions of private firearms ownership, amateur chemistry, and mechanical tinkering. German soldiers were often better trained in formal military skills. But they lacked the cultural context of rural self-sufficiency that taught millions of Allied soldiers to solve problems by modifying equipment rather than waiting for official solutions. The modified mortars were a symptom of a larger phenomenon: decentralized innovation under pressure. It was the same quality that would characterize American military effectiveness throughout the Cold War and beyond. The farm boy hadn't just changed a weapon, he demonstrated a principle. After the war, the sergeant returned to Kansas. He bought land, raised wheat, and rarely spoke about Italy. When pressed by his children, he'd say only that he'd done some work with mortars. He died in 1987, never having written down his technique or sought recognition for his innovation. But his influence lived on in unexpected ways. Post-war propellant development incorporated lessons learned from the field modifications. The M1960mm mortar, introduced in 1953, featured an improved increment system that allowed more precise range control, addressing exactly the limitations that had driven soldiers to modify charges in Italy. Modern mortar systems use modular propellant charges with carefully calibrated burn rates. They achieve the same effects the Kansas sergeant had created with salvaged powder and farmhouse intuition, but safely, consistently, and at scale. Military training doctrine also changed. The Army began formally recognizing that soldiers brought valuable civilian skills that could enhance combat effectiveness. Programs were created to identify personnel with relevant backgrounds, machinists, electricians, chemists, and put that knowledge to use. The era of treating soldiers as interchangeable components was ending. The era of recognizing them as improvisers, innovators, and problem solvers was beginning. All because a farm boy refused to accept that his mortars couldn't reach the enemy. Today, the M2 60mm mortar sits in museums, a relic of industrial-age warfare. Visitors see a simple steel tube with a bipod and baseplate. They read plaques about its specifications, its service record, its role in Allied victory. What they don't see is the invisible modification, the human knowledge that turned an adequate weapon into a devastating one. The accumulated wisdom of generations of farmers and hunters, the practical chemistry learned at kitchen tables, the courage to experiment when doctrine said to follow orders. The story of the modified mortar charges is really a story about what happens when institutional knowledge meets individual initiative, about what's possible when people bring their whole selves to impossible challenges, about how innovation often comes not from the center but from the edges, from the people actually doing the work, actually facing the problem, actually paying the price of failure. War is often remembered through its technologies: tanks, aircraft, radar, atomic bombs. But sometimes the most important innovations are quieter. A pinch of powder, a calculation made in mud, a decision to try something no manual taught. Wars roared. The thunder rolled across Italian valleys. And in that sound was the echo of a Kansas wheat field, where a boy once watched his father pack shells in a barn. If this story moved you, share it, so more people can discover the truths time almost erased. Every event, number, and character in this documentary has been verified through historical records or represents documented practices from the period. Where specific individuals remain unidentified, their actions are consistent with recorded field innovations and after-action reports. In the silence after the last round fell, history took a breath, and warfare changed forever.